Okay, I want to show you some additional duotone effects here. Now, the first thing that I'm going to do though is I'm going to go and revert this guy back. So you can choose File, Revert if you like, or I'm just going to hit F12 on my keyboard. The only thing that I didn't like about the techniques that I showed you in the previous exercise is I'm not a big fan of that duotone interface to start off with. And the other thing too is we're changing the color space of our image. And again, if I'm sending this out for commercial reproduction, I got to be careful about that. So let me show you some other techniques that don't involve changing color modes and things like this. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use an adjustment layer. Once again, another hue saturation adjustment layer. So what I'll do here inside the layers panel is I'll head down to my adjustment layer menu and of course look for hue saturation. Now, because we've done this a bunch of times already, we know exactly what happens. We get that hue saturation adjustment layer back inside the layers palette, and Photoshop boots us over into the adjustments panel. Okay, great. Now, the next thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to turn on this colorize option down at the bottom of the adjustments layer. And what I wind up with, essentially, is pretty much what we had in the same exercise. So now what I have is a black and white image, essentially, with a color overlay on it. So if I look inside my adjustments panel, I see that the hue slider has been dropped all the way to the left, but I can drag on that hue slider to go and change the color that's sort of overlaying across the top of my image, if you will. So I can go into blues and purples and, over into the reds and things like this, or maybe back into the greens. I can use my saturation slider. I mentioned the saturation slider earlier. That will increase the color saturation, giving me more richer color, I guess you could say. Or I can fade it back. I can drop it back. But if I drop it back too far, then I'm going to wind up with a black and white image, right? We know that already. So I'm going to bring my saturation just up a little bit there. And then the lightness slider, as we know already, is going to increase the amount of white or the amount of black inside my image. Now I'm doing some pretty dramatic changes here just to show you the difference. But in the real world, I would make very minute changes, maybe, somewhere in here, or maybe up just a little more, depending on what I'm after, right? There you go. That's another effect that you can use. Now, I want to show you yet another technique for creating some duotone effects here. Once again, what I'll do is I'll revert this guy back, F12 on the keyboard, take us all the way back to where we started. And I'm going to head back to the layers palette here. I want to create some additional adjustment layers that are going to use commands that I've shown you already way back at the beginning of this discussion on special effects. I was showing you commands like threshold and posterize and things like this. So I'm going to use the threshold command here as an adjustment layer, and I'll show you a couple of cool effects that we can pull off here. So back inside the layers palette, down to the adjustment menu there, the adjustment layer menu there, and I'm going to choose threshold from the menu. We wind up here with something like this. Again, inside the adjustments panel, I can mess around with the histogram there if I want. Again, introducing more blacks or more whites, depending on what I'm after. And again, that kind of gives me that, I like that effect, kind of like an inked drawing effect. Okay, so maybe I wind up somewhere in here. I want a little bit of detail in there, so maybe something like this, right? Now, I want to mention that at this point, what you might want to do is you might want to blur your image a little bit. Go and apply a blur filter if you want. I'm not going to bother, though, but you might want to do that. And then the next thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to go and create yet another hue saturation adjustment layer. So back to the layers palette, down to the adjustment layer menu, and of course, hue saturation. There we go. I'm going to turn on colorize down at the bottom. And then here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to set my hue slider to, let's see here, I'm going to set this to 100. You don't have to use the exact same values I'm using, by the way, but my saturation slider, I'm going to bring that up to about 50. And my lightness slider, check this out. Right now, the lightness slider is at 0. If I drag this lightness slider to the right, check out what happens. Now I'm getting this green showing up inside my photo, right? Maybe something like this. Maybe that's what I'm after, right? Now, what I can do, this is, to me, is really cool. This green that I'm seeing inside my photo is coming off of this value that I set for the hue slider. So maybe I don't want green. Maybe I want blues, or maybe I want purples, or, into reds or yellows, or who the heck knows, right? I'll leave that up to you. Maybe I'll wind up with, sort of a desert color here, maybe I don't know, somewhere in here, right? So I can drag the lightness slider to the right, and I'm getting this kind of an effect. So in other words, all of the former black areas are now being colored with this color that I've set on the hue slider. But check this out. If I drag to the left, I go back into the blacks, and then out the other side, and now all of the white areas are now being colored with the color that I set on the hue slider. Isn't that cool? So in other words, maybe I want to keep my blacks. Maybe I want to preserve the blacks. If I want to preserve blacks, then I have to drag to the left. I have to drag my lightness slider to the left. If I want to preserve the whites and colorize the blacks, then I'm going to drag the lightness slider to the right. Pretty cool, isn't it? Anyway, I'm going to leave it at that. You can spend hours here having fun goofing around with this guy. Try messing around with your sliders, see what you can come up with. Have some fun with these duotone effects.